Hello everyone. In this part, let's start with Rule 4.13. No responsibility to identify beneficiary except to the extent that a standby requires presentation of an electronic record, which means this rule will apply only if the standby not requires an electronic presentation. If electronic presentation is required by the standby, then this rule won't apply. So as far as a standby not requires an electronic presentation, a person honoring a presentation has no obligation to the applicant to ascertain the identity of any person making a presentation or any assignee of proceeds. Which means what? An issuer is not obligated to check the identity of a person making the presentation, including the assignee, if it is not an electronic presentation. If it is an electronic presentation, then it must identify. Right? We will see who is this assignee in our upcoming rules. Next, what is the obligation of the issuer under a standby? To pay the beneficiary upon receipt of demand and complying documents. And if the issuer is making payment to a named beneficiary, transferee, and acknowledged assignee, successor by operation of law, we will see all these terms in our upcoming rules, right? If the issuer is making payment to any of these persons to an account or account number stated in the standby or in a cover instruction from the beneficiary or nominated person, fulfills the obligation under the standby to effect payment. So to make payment to the beneficiary, if the issuer did any of these measures, then its obligation is discharged, right? Now the question is, what if the issuer made the payment to a person who is not the true beneficiary? The answer is the applicant must reimburse the issuer twice if the true beneficiary makes a complaint demand for the payment under the standby. So actually this is a risk to the applicant if it is not an electronic presentation. Next one is name of acquired or merged issuer or confirmer. If the issuer or confirmer is reorganized, merged, or changes its name, any required reference by name to the issuer or confirmer in the documents presented may be to it or its successor. This happens when the issuer or confirmer merged or changed its name during the validity of the standby. If that is the case, then the beneficiary is allowed to use either the old name or the new name as the case may be. It is not considered as a discrepancy. For the reason the issuer changed the name, why the beneficiary has to be deprived? So it is not a discrepancy. The beneficiary is free to use the old name or the new name. Even some cases the beneficiary may not be aware of this consolidation or merger, right? Next one is original, copy and multiple documents. This rule clarifies how to interpret the terms original and copy when any of these terms referred in the standby. A presented document must be an original, which means by default the required document under the standby must be submitted in original. But if the standby specifically calls for a copy, then this condition will not be applied, right? Next, presentation of an electronic record where an electronic presentation is permitted or required is deemed to be an original, which means if the document is presented as an electronic record, then it will be considered that the presented document is original. Whenever a document is submitted as an electronic record, it will be deemed to be the original document, right? Next one is a presented document is deemed to be an original unless it appears on its face to have been reproduced from an original. A document which appears to have been reproduced from an original is deemed to be an original if the signature or authentication appears to be original. So here literally the deciding factor is whether the signature seems to be original or not. So to consider a document as original, it has to meet any of these following requirements. First one is it must not be reproduced from an original, that is taking photocopy of the original. For example, here the document in the left side will be considered as original, right? Because on its face it seems to be original, the signature seems to be original, so we can consider this document as an original. But the document in the right side is clearly a copy, while on its face apparently this document seems to be a copy and this signature is also seems to be a copy. But the second case is like this. In this case we can clearly identify this document is a copy, that is a photocopy, but this signature of the issuer is still original. So we cannot say this is a copy. This document is considered as an original. Why? Because the issuer's signature is original on the document. So signature is the deciding factor while considering a document as original or copy, right? Next one is a standby that requires presentation of a copy permits presentation of either an original or copy unless the standby states that only a copy to be presented or otherwise addresses the disposition of all originals. This means if standby requires copy of a document, then the presenter is free to submit the original of the same, but it cannot be vice versa, right? Note this very carefully. But if the standby states only a copy of a document has to be presented, or states copy of the document has to be presented and along with states how to dispose the original documents, then only a copy must be presented. In such cases, if original is presented, then it is a discrepancy. For example, in this case, a standby requires submission of copy of an insurance document and it's not mentioned anything further. In this case, the beneficiary is free to submit the original insurance document. But in this case, the standby requires the beneficiary to self-certify that he has sent the sole original of this insurance document to the applicant and also requires copy of the insurance document for making the demand. In this case, the beneficiary must submit the copy. Why? Because the standby clearly addressed the disposition of original documents. That is, the original documents has to be sent to the applicant. If in this case, if the beneficiary submitted the original insurance document, then it is a discrepancy, right? But in this case, the beneficiary can submit the original document. Clear. Next one, if multiples of the same document are requested, only one must be an original, unless duplicate originals or multiple originals are requested, in which case all must be original, or two copies, twofold or the like are requested, in which case either originals or copies may be presented. Here the concern is, what if multiples of the same document is required under the standby? In this case, at least one document must be original and others can be copy. But if the standby specifically requires duplicate originals or multiple originals, then all must be originals because only original is asked in the standby. Next is, if the standby requires a document in two copies or in twofold or similar terms, then the beneficiary can submit the documents either as original or copy. Actually, here this part is different from UCP because in UCP, if the credit requires documents in twofold, then at least one must be originals, others can be copy. If it is in threefold, then one must be at least original, other two can be copy. But here either all can be original or all can be copy, right? For example, the standby requires 3 certificate of default without mentioning anything further. In this case, at least one certificate of default must be an original document, other two can be copy. But in this same case, if the standby requires 2 original certificate of default, in such cases 2 documents must be original. But in this same case, if the standby requires certificate of default in twofold, then either the beneficiary can submit the both certificate of default in original or both certificate of default in copy, or one in original or one in copy, right? That is allowed. So by this, let's end this part, and in the next part we will discuss from rule 4.16, and that part will cover the most basic required documents under a standby.